In this video, I will continue talking about the JSON Web Token and how you can use JSON Web Token with the authentication system. So we will build an authentication server that uses JWT using Node.js. So let's get started. So first of all, let me give some kind of theory about what a modern token-based authentication server look like. So imagine you have an application, and this application requires some authentication from the user. Normally, these authentication systems require the user to pass the credentials, the username and password. So here the actor try to use the client and try to log in. So it passes the username and password. The client then passes this by calling the kind of the login API from the server. Normally this is a post request passing these credentials. Now the server, it will try to verify these username and password by calling a database. And if there's a match, if the username and password are valid, and then it will return back a token, which is basically a JWT token, back to the client. Now, if the client try to call another API, kind of protected API, there is no need to pass the credentials again. Instead, you use the authorization header, and basically by putting the token here using the bearer schema, and you send that to the server. Then the server will only try to validate if this token is valid or not. If it is valid, then it will return back the success response to the user. If it's not, then it will kind of error out. So this is kind of the basic idea about a token-based authentication server that uses JWT. Now, when you try to compare this to the traditional cookie-based authentication, you notice that this is completely stateless. There is no need to manage the sessions here. And because the credentials are only passed only once. This subsequent request will use the token instead. And the token itself kind of represents the claims. So the advantage here is that you can also see the server doesn't need to make subsequent calls to the database. It only needs to happen once, which gives a kind of a performance gain, since now to validate the token it was required rather than just calling the database again. And also, like, there's no need really to use cookies, to pass cookies between the client and server. And since cookies are bound to domains, so there's no need to kind of worry about the cross-origin issue anymore, especially with mobile devices. Now let's talk about the authentication server we are going to build. So it basically follows the 3 tiers or 3-layer architecture. Going from the bottom one, which is the database layer over here, we will use the database to store our credentials, like the username and password. Since, as I mentioned, we're going to use Node.js here, I'm going to use some NeDB, which is an embedded database, to store these data. Then the next layer, which is the service layer. Now the service layer will basically have some methods like login, register, and which will call the methods from the database layer. Now on the top layer we will have the controller, which will represent kind of the handling of the request and the response for each of the routes, which is, as I mentioned, we will have a route for login, we'll have a route for a register, which will accept kind of the username and password and the request, and then return back the token. All of these methods here in the controller basically will call the methods in the service, as we will see. So each layer is dependent on the layer below it. So the service depends on the database, the controller depends on this service. Okay, so now we will move to the authentication server we are going to build. So this one will expose 3 web APIs. The first one is to register the user, which will accept a post request. The second API will be the login API, which will also accept a post request for the username and password, and will return back the JWT token back. And then a third API will be a GET request. We will call it like check token, which will verify the token if it's valid or not. So here I'm using Node.js for this, and I'm using the Express framework to make it easier to build these APIs. So here you can look into the dependencies. I just started with a kind of your typical Node.js application and install these dependencies. The first one is the Express, which is our kind of MVC based framework to build web application Node.js. The second dependency, body parser, basically to accept kind of the post parameters, to parse those, and then the Bcrypt library to hash the passwords, so that for security reasons is safer. And then finally the JSON Web Token to generate the tokens, and the NeDB, as I mentioned earlier, is basically we will kind of store the database, the username and password in a database. And so NeDB, it's kind of a native, embedded database that provide you with persistent or in memory. That's kind of 100% JavaScript based with no binary dependencies. JSON Web Token, it's basically to generate and verify the tokens, and as I mentioned for Bcrypt, basically to hashing the passwords. So let's start with the first file here, which is our main file, the server. I'm just loading the dependency for Express, then the second line for the body parser, and then I have a file for the route called the user router, and then here's your basically typical Express server. I'm just creating a new instance, new server instance from Express, then using this middleware for the JSON for the body parser, and then this is just a test middleware just to log the request that I'm receiving here. And next means that you move to the next middleware so that you don't block kind of the pipeline of the request. Finally here I'm saying that all of the APIs will be within this route called /user, just from naming perspective. And finally we will, on line 13, we will listen on port 3000. And next, we will have the files, the modules, the database, and the router, and the controller, and the service, all under the source folder here. So starting from the DB folder here, again, here I'm on the first line, I'm just loading the NeDB dependency, which basically expose this this class called data store. And then on the next line, I'm importing the promisify function from the util core module. What is this? Like, the reason for that is most of the kind of methods that exposed by NeDB data store are using the callback pattern, but for me personally, I like to work with the promises, and that's why this utility function here, it's very helpful to convert any kind of callback pattern to be promise instead. But just I want to mention that you need to have Node.js, like I think they added it after Node.js 8, so you need to use like Node.js 8 and above. For me, like I tested this with Node.js version 12. And moving on, here I'm just on line 4, I'm just creating the database from the data store. On line 5 and 6, these are basically the methods that will, the first one called insert promise. So this is just, will return a promise and will accept the object that you want to insert to the database. And then the find one promise will basically, as the name suggests, is that you will find the record by whatever arguments you are providing. I want to mention here is that the NeDB kind of very similar to MongoDB. If you work with MongoDB before, kind of follow kind of similar namings, similar structure too. And that's it. That's our DB module. When finally we just export this object. Also, like I want to mention here is that I'm using memory, so I'm not persistent to a file. Like you can easily really convert this to be persistent to a file by adding just one line. You can look into the documentation for NeDB how to do that. But for me, just for simplicity, I put everything in memory. Next thing, we will move to the service layer. So again, for the service, we are going to need 3 methods. The first one to register, second one for login, and the third one to check the token. Now, I wanted to mention here something is that I'm using here, I'm creating a factory method, which you see here on line 7, which is called create user service. The reason behind it is I wanted to inject the dependency here. This is kind of a simple pattern for doing dependency injection without the need to kind of hard tight couple like with the dependency of the DB here. Since this service, if you recall from the diagram I mentioned, it depends on the DB module. I'm here passing the DB here, so that in case you want to use a different implementation for the DB, you really don't need to change anything here, since you are passing it as a dependency. There's no really tight coupling here. I will show you where we are passing the DB, which is going to be in the user router file. So I'm going to use the same pattern with the controller too. So this is kind of just to FYI. Now there is a couple of dependencies here, which is on line 1, I'm just using the JSON Web Token module and to generate the token and also to sign this token and to verify the token. The Bcrypt module is also to, as I mentioned, to hash the passwords when we save them so that we don't save them as plain text. And like the secret and the salt rounds like the secret, we'll use it with the JWT generation and verification. All around, we'll use it with the Bcrypt. I will go through that now in a minute. So on line 7, as I mentioned, you create a method, a factory method, that will return an object. This object called the user service, which the first method called register here, and on register, this accepts a username and password. Just to keep it simple, you can have more properties if you like, more fields, but just for the sake of simplicity here, going to depends only on username and password. And on line 11, we will call the Bcrypt module. It has a method called hash, and what it takes a password, and then it will take also salt rounds. Now for the salt rounds, to give you an idea, it's basically kind of consider the cost factor. So the higher the number, the higher the number of rounds required to for the hashing of the passwords. And that's why we need a salt round here that Bcrypt will use. So hash will return a promise. So here, that's why we use the then. If everything is successful, we'll get the hash. Then we call the DB module, assuming we have the insert promise method there. And then we pass the username and the password, which will be the hash password. Then we will create the document, and we just return that document. As simple as that. The second method here is called login, and what login do is takes a username and password and try to see if the username and password is valid or not. So on line 19, I'm calling the define one record promise from the DB module, passing the username, and if there is a record that matches the username, I'm just logging it here for testing. And then on line 21, I'm just check if there is a record. Then I'm calling the Bcrypt again to compare if the password on that record is similar to the password passed, which is also should be hash with the hash password. And if there is a match, then I'm basically calling which is what match here, going to reflect on line 24. If the match is true, then I will go ahead and generate the token. Now the JWT module has a method called sign. The sign will take the claim object, which in this case I chose to return the username and then some expiration date for an hour here. I chose for this, and then the secret. The secret again will be used for the signature of this token, and then we will return the token back. If something goes wrong, which means the username password didn't found for some reason, then just throw this error. That's it for the login. Finally, for the check token method here, it simply takes a token and a callback, and what it will do is we will call the verify method from the JWT module, just to make sure. What the verify will do is we'll check if this token is valid by checking the issuer, by checking the expiration date, all of these things that refers that the JWT is still valid. And so it takes the token, it takes the same secret we used to sign this token, and it will return the callback for it is the error, because this is an error first pattern for Node.js. and then the decoded result. And if there's an error, we just return that error to the callback. Otherwise, we just return the username. And that's it. This is our service. Now the next file is the controller. The controller will have the same methods, which is for login, for register, and for check token, except that it will accepts different arguments, since the controller will basically handle the request and return back the response. So it will accept the request and response, and then the next, for the middleware that matches the Express. So again, as I talked earlier, I'm going to use the same pattern like the factory. And again, since this controller is dependent on the user service, so I'm just injecting this service here. And with this factory method will return a user controller object for us. Now on line 4 for the register, this method accepts the request and then the response and then the next method function. And then on line 5, just logging this body here. And I have typo. And then on line 6, I'm just calling the user service register, passing the username and password, which we takes from the body, because this one is going to be a post request, so it's going to be in the body of the request. And then since register returns a promise, if everything is correct, then we return 200 with this response, which is okay, and then user with the document, and that's it. And if there's anything kind of went wrong for some reason, then we return like a 400 for and then when for the OK is false and what type of error message is there. And for the next method is the login method, which is kind of accept the same arguments, the request and response and the next. And calling the user service, call the login. I pass the username and password from the body request, because this one is also a post request, so the username and password will be part of the body of the request. And the login will basically return a token back for us if everything is successful. So I'm just returning the token with this within this object with OK equal true. If the username and password didn't match, then I will return 400 also with the OK false, and then what's the type of error message. And finally, the user controller method, which is called check token. This is, as I mentioned, a GET request, so it will accept the same kind of request and response, and we will call the check token from the user service, passing the token. So since this one is a GET request, so we'll pass the token as a query parameter. Now I wanted to mention, like in real applications, you need to pass it as inside the authorization header. But for simplicity, I just put it here in the query parameter. Let me know if you want me to implement also on the authorization header by, for example, building in another service for that, another API for that, just to demonstrate this. Now moving on, since this one is accept a callback, with the error first and then the results on the data. If there's an error, we'll return 400 and saying that something went wrong, what's the error for that. Otherwise, we just return 200 with the user data. And finally, our user router is really simple. It doesn't do anything other than injecting the dependencies for each other. So here I'm using the router from the Express, on line 1. On line 2, here I'm basically kind of importing the user module, controller module, and then next I'm importing the user service module, and finally I'm importing the DB module. And since as you saw, like the service depends on the DB and the control depends on the service, I'm here instantiate the user service, passing the DB to the factory method, doing the same thing for the controller by passing the user service to that, and finally create the router. And for the router, I'm saying for the check token is going to be a GET request, and we're going to use the check token from the user controller to handle this request. For the login is going to be a post, and it's going to be using the login method to handle this request. Finally, for the register, this is the same thing. And here I'm just creating a test username password just to test things. And that's it. Now let's run our server. Now you can see here I created an npm task here. So to run the server file here, so easiest way to do is to do npm start or npm run start. What it's saying here is that it's running the server on line 3000. So how we can test this, like for me, I prefer to use Postman for this. So you can use curl if you like. There's like different ways. It's just an API server, so it's up to you what to use. So for me, I would just like use the Postman. So what Postman is, kind of it provide you a UI to simplifies the ways to make requests to your username, to your APIs basically. So the first API we have is the register API. Now this is the path for it. Our server /user, then /register. And then here you can see I'm saying it's a post request. And here I'm saying pass the body. Now when I do, since it's supposed to require like a body, and the format of this body is row. And I'm here selecting like it's need to be a JSON, since I'm using the JSON parser for it. As simple as that. Now, if you recall that the parameters we need to pass is the username and then password. So let's create this user 1 2 3 4 5 6. Here you go. So this is our request, our response basically on the bottom part. You see we have a 200 response, and then we have OK as true, and then the document that we received back from the NeDB. And you can see like the document has the username that we passed, and then the password, which is hashed, and then the ID. That's what NeDB will provide you. It's kind of like your primary key. So please don't use this in production. I'm just here just to demonstrate this. Like normally you don't return back the password and username back to the response. So this is our first API. Now let's test our login. Now the way we do this is like I already kind of tested here. So it's a post request passing the login path, the /user /login, same thing by passing the request in the body of the post request and in the JSON format. And then I'm going to say Joe with 1 2 3 4 5. Remember, we created the username and password with Joe 1 2 3 4 5 6, and see like the response here for 401, which is unauthorized. So you're unauthorized because the password didn't match. So here, like, this is our response saying that username or password could not be found. Now, if I change this to 6, bang, here we get back the 200 request response, and then kind of the OK saying true, and then the most important part, which is our token, our JWT token. And if we take this token now, what we will use it to test our last API, which is called the check token. And again, this method, this API, basically it's a GET request. So it accepts, this is the path for it, and this one is the query parameter. So here the query parameter, if you recall from the code, is called token. So here, that's like, I have some sample token here. See, since like this token, I think it's old, like I used it way before, so it's not valid. So this is what I return back as 401. And let me actually decode this. So if I go to Node.io here, go to the debugger, and yes, so I think this is our newest JWT, but I wanted to copy this one instead. If I go back here, paste it, yeah, see, like the expiration date is too old, and probably even the password is wrong for this one. Now going back to Postman, again, I will take the JWT here, I paste it in the query parameter, and now you can see like we have 200 response, OK is true, and the username as Joe, which is like kind of the in the record in the NeDB database. So in case you don't want to use Postman, you would like to use curl instead, I'll leave also like the curl request in the repo itself. But here, for example, from Postman, if you click on the code section, you can copy the curl request here. And then if we go to the command line, paste this, we get the same result, which is here. As I mentioned, I'll leave this in the repo for you in case you prefer this. Just copy paste that. Just change the, for example, the parameters that you're passing, in this case, the token. So I hope this was helpful, and please let me know if you have any question or if I have missed anything. Thank you for your time.